All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining Political Research Associates today for a roundtable discussion on mobilizing misogyny in the service of authoritarianism. We are so happy to have repeat audience members joining us throughout this series as we embark on our fourth webinar leading up to the 2020 election. For those of you joining us today who are new to Political Research Associates, PRA is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research analysis and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. Today, we will be discussing the relationship between misogyny and authoritarianism, the ways in which we see misogyny fuel right-wing movements and erode democratic institutions, and the wisdom and strategies of movement organizers who center feminist practice in building democracy globally. For this discussion, we are joined by Alex DeBranco, co-founder and executive director of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, Shireen Essoff, executive director of JAS, Just Associates, Isabel Marler, advancing universal rights and justice coordinator for AWID, or the Association for Women's Rights in Development, and Tarso Luis Ramos, executive director of PRA. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start us off with our first question for Tarso, acknowledging upfront that we are starting a conversation on misogyny with the one man on our panel. All of our panelists today write and think deeply about misogyny. Tarso, you most regularly write and think deeply about authoritarianism. So I'd like to start today's discussion by asking you, why does PRA center its analysis of authoritarianism on misogyny rather than, say, racism, xenophobia, religious nationalism, or economic inequality?
So accepting responsibility for having shaped this discussion around authoritarianism, we thought we would take accountability for that and talk a little bit about why. Not to argue with my colleague, Koki, I wouldn't say that at PRA we displace these other building blocks or drivers of authoritarianism in our analysis, so much as that we're insistent on keeping misogyny and patriarchy at the center of that analysis alongside and intertwined with, particularly the drivers of theocratic movements, racial and ethnic nationalist movements, and severe economic inequality through neoliberal or other economic arrangements of severe inequality. If we look around the globe, liberal democracies, however actually undemocratic, are in crisis. And we're living through what political scientists agree is a third global wave of authoritarianism, right? The first one that built up to mid-century fascism, a second post-war wave, the sort that produced military dictatorships most kind of archetypically, propped up either by the US, the Soviet Union, the wave that drove my family, for instance, from military dictatorship in Brazil. And we're now in a third wave, right? So wherever we see liberal democracies in crisis, from Poland to Brazil, Hungary to the Philippines, India to Israel, and certainly in the United States, we tend to see some admixture of these three drivers, right? Severe economic inequality, theocratic or mass conservative religious-based movements, and the rise of racial and ethnic nationalism, sometimes in tandem, combined as in Hindutva or Hindu fascism, and sometimes with different tendencies, like in the US, where we have a very powerful religious right that is also Christian nationalist in some of its dimensions, but also then an overtly white supremacist wing and movement. So we tend to, as a researcher in the European theater who I respect likes to joke, it's as if you had a different bartender in each of these countries making a cocktail with the same ingredients. Is it a little bit more theocratic, a little bit more racial and ethnic nationalist, is a little bit more sort of corporate or oligarchic in its tendencies, but we have these elements. And if PRA attempts to put some additional emphasis on misogyny and patriarchy in our framework, it's just partially as a corrective. I mean, what's peculiar is that in doing so should make us something of an outlier, right? After all, foundational work on authoritarianism in the post-World War II period, including Theodore Adorno's work on authoritarian personality, strongly has linked gender traditionalism and hierarchy to preference for authoritarian leadership. And much of the subsequent work on right-wing authoritarianism has been largely consistent, right, with that kind of analysis. And yet, there's a tendency in journalism and scholarship and in politics to treat misogyny and male supremacy as tangential rather than foundational. The reasons for that are perhaps not so mysterious, and I think we'll maybe get into some of that in this discussion, but it's a real problem that requires a corrective. I think the last thing I'll say is just in terms of the politics of averting and overcoming authoritarianism, because this isn't just about like a clinical diagnosis. And it's also PRA's observation that anti-authoritarian resistance, right, whether in Rojava or in the streets of Brazil, Belarus, or in the United States with the movement for Black Lives, Women's March, is largely led by women, right? Whether cis, trans, queer, or straight, if we're serious about both understanding and averting or defeating authoritarianism and building actual multiracial feminist democracy, which is to say democracy, we had better be serious about dismantling patriarchy and leaning into social justice or global South or Black feminist organizing models that have already proven to be most animated and strongest with respect to fighting for democracy and freedom for all of us. And so that's why we think it's useful to put the question of misogyny and patriarchy in conversation with the question of rising authoritarianism.
Thank you, Tarso. Thank you for setting the stage for us today. Alex, I'm going to turn to you. You co-founded the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism in part to expose and challenge common narratives that provide shelter to male supremacist movements. Why have these narratives in the male supremacist agenda gone unchecked, as Tarso alluded to, and what is occluding misogyny in popular analysis of anti-democratic trends and movements?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I think that the place to start, perhaps, is with our decision to frame our work around the concept of supremacist movements rather than extremism or radicalization, which are common frameworks in looking at right-wing ideologies. And the motivation for that is the understanding that male supremacy, like white supremacy, as has been discussed, more in the mainstream following the protests around the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, is that male supremacy is an intrinsic part of the mainstream. It has manifestations that we can consider radical, but even violent manifestations of male supremacy and misogyny are not radical. Domestic abuse, sexual violence. These are acts of violence that happen in really substantial rates that are part of mainstream culture. Rape culture, victim blaming, the assumption that women make false accusations, the legitimacy of that misinformation in mainstream coverage. This is all a really significant part of what goes on around male supremacy and its continued reinforcement. And so part of what has been difficult about bringing attention to these issues, even the term male supremacism is not something that had been used frequently. And what we often saw in research on the Christian right in these patriarchal traditional root movements was an attempt to dismiss the aspects that were misogynist or dehumanizing as aspects of religious faith and therefore not something that we could criticize. And I think that the growth which has happened since the advances of the women's rights movement, but has especially picked up steam and attention over the past decade of these secular misogynist groups and ideologies that don't use the same smokescreen of faith, of benevolent sexism, in the ambivalent sexism that characterizes society in which women stay in their place, are viewed with chivalry and protective that goes hand in hand with hostile sexism. Women step out of their place, that they are attacked and demonized. And those have especially characterized white supremacist movements who have idolized the white women in their movements. So we've seen this shift, this increasing secular misogyny, this increasing hostile misogyny, the increasing focus on feminism as the problem. And this is all happening while male supremacy continues to be an intrinsic part of our government, and not only of the right wing, but of our movements on the left as well, is a serious problem. And the insidious nature of male supremacism and misogyny when it is in liberal and left movements is that it makes it harder to get them to criticize this problem because it is entrenched in those movements themselves. And so the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism is attempting to, name what this is as male supremacism very blatantly, and bring a new attention and understanding that brings together this spectrum, which I know PRA does as well, because I learned the margins to mainstream and mainstream to margins framework from my time there as an intern 10 years ago.
Thank you, Alex. That's really interesting to hear where the Institute is coming from. Shireen, Isabel, do either of you want to respond to this question of, why are we talking about misogyny less than we should be?
Yes, firstly, thank you for the invitation to be in conversation with everybody. I want to bounce off, the frame that Tasso shared and that PRA is currently using, because I think, we are in a moment globally where we are seeing structural systems of oppression consolidating power, right? And each of those systems has its own modality. So, Tasso, when you speak about the version of the cocktail, right, and the mix of ingredients, I think that is really, really key. And so, the overlapping of a racism and a patriarchy will breed toxic masculinity, and misogyny. If you add in colonialism, you've got an overlap with misogyny and, the complete destruction of nature, which leads you to the system of extractivism. And, the preferencing of individual over community that intersects with capitalism, and that brings you back into a white supremacy model. And I think at its heart, authoritarianism as a way of controlling the system, rooted in mechanics of violence, is absolutely key. And I think it is a very particular, as you spoke to Tasso, Black-centered, radical, social justice, global South feminism that I think does provide you an entry into a conversation about the imagination of systems that could look different in service of a freer, more emancipated, right, modality and society.
Thank you, Shireen. I'm going to turn to a quote from Peter Beinart, who will be joining us actually next week for PRA's webinar on Christian Zionism, really looking at the manifestations of misogyny and patriarchy seeing the sort of the frequent illusion of the public sphere with the private sphere when talking about these phenomena. And you mentioned this, Alex, in talking about the prevalence of domestic abuse as an example. But Peter says, new authoritarianism underscores the importance of an old feminist mantra. The personal is political. Foster women's equality in the home, and you may save democracy itself. How do gender roles in the home and people's private sexual and gender identities relate to the public contestation of power? And I want to open this question to all of you.
Mm-hmm. Shall I go? I can go. Yeah, so, I think the question itself, you kind of alluded to the fact that this is a false division. So, but I think it bears repeating. I think, feminists have been saying this for a long time. The idea that your gender identity, your sexual orientation, or, can be kind of contained within the private sphere just doesn't hold up in terms of your experience in the street, trying to access healthcare, etc., whatever it may be. And as Shireen said really beautifully, these structures on a structural level, patriarchy, heteronormativity, colonial and neoliberal structures, they're consolidating each other. And this idea to separate the public and the private is something that can be very helpful to the kind of anti-rights or regressive forces that we're talking about. I think there's a way that reactionary forces can make that separation, and therefore they can normalize a concept of a patriarchal or heteronormative family. They can make that natural because it's in the private sphere, right? And within, you know, this kind of ultra-conservative worldview, this heteronormative family is kind of the nuclear unit of the nation, right? So deviating from this norm is not just deviating from a private norm of the family, it's deviating from, you know, what it is to be a citizen, what it is to be, you know, part of the nation. And there's an interesting book that I read a bit of by Lakoff, and he was talking about the Christian right ideology being based on like a strict fatherhood model of like discipline and obedience and punishment as well, and that kind of can be extrapolated up to like a worldview of the whole of society, right? And within this kind of conception of family and nation, it's women's bodies that are the battleground. You know, women are there to reproduce the nation or the race or the religion, or, you know, the concoction, the cocktail of all those things. Meanwhile, trans people, non-binary people, queer people are somehow deviant to both that like private family model and to this, you know, the reproduction of the nation. So I think that's how those two levels are linked, at least in the way that we're looking at things.
Thank you, Isabel. Would anyone like to chime in here?
2 points to build on what it is that Isabel has raised. The systems that we are trapped in reproduce themselves based on the control of bodies. Right? Whether it's women being confined into very, very specific roles linked to reproduction, as Isabel has flagged, whether it's in terms of labor and the meaning of the control and regulation of bodies in relation to neoliberal capitalist agendas, whether it's in terms of race, you know, in terms of that disaggregation. And so I think there's something so fundamental about the control of women's bodies in service of the reproduction of the system, that to tamper with that is a threat to power, because it potentially completely dismantles, right? And I think that's why anti-gender ideology, or the contestation on the site of women's bodies, the meaning of trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people, becomes one of the key things, right?
Thank you, Shireen. I'm going to move us in a direction that we unfortunately need to head, because we would be remiss if we did not directly address the fervent misogyny of the US head of state, President Donald Trump, an accused rapist who has boasted about sexually harassing women and who has sexualized his own daughter on multiple occasions, a man who uses gendered language to demonize his opponents and strong female political leaders on both sides of the aisle. While President Trump's behavior is emblematic of the misogyny that underpins authoritarian regimes, I'd like to use this example to discuss unintuitive coalition building on the right. Despite the clear hypocrisy in biblical morality versus the behavior and track record of the president, why did white evangelical Christians turn out in force in 2016 to vote for Trump? And what shared goals have enabled the Christian right to remain his staunch supporters 4 years later? Again, I'm going to open this question up to the full panel. So whoever would like to take a first whack at it.
I think that I want to start with this question by picking up on Shireen's really excellent point about control of bodies, because, you know, and you know, contesting a little bit the idea of how unintuitive the coalition building really is. If we think about some of the defining characteristics of how we think of the versions of Christian right misogyny versus more secular iterations of misogyny, anti-abortion has been a big part of Christian right movements. and the secular movements such as misogynist incels and pickup artists and men's rights activists. A lot of that is around control of women's bodies in terms of sexual violence and sometimes physical violence, and weakening laws that protect violence against women. Both anti-abortion laws as well as coerced and forced sterilization that often targets immigrant women and women of color, are as forms of reproductive control and sexual violence are both about the control of women's bodies. And the control of women's bodies is a really key part of male supremacism. And male supremacism has different manifestations through the Mike Pence Christian right, I won't have dinner with someone who's not my wife style of traditional patriarchy, and the Trump overt, hostile, misogynist objectification brand of misogyny, but they're coming from the same roots in the end. And so I think that understanding that, you know, I mentioned before this psychological concept of ambivalent sexism, that we have both benevolent and hostile sexism that make up in a traditional, you know, patriarchal system, that the hostile sexism part is always hand in hand with benevolent sexism. And so just because it's amplified in Trump's objectification, it's not essentially a real problem for conservative evangelicals. And then the second part of it, you know, bringing in the more intersectional frame, is that emphasis on them being white and white evangelical, coming from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant conception of the founding of the United States, and their work over time to continue to sustain and reinforce Christian white male supremacy as a universal. And so the, you know, racism and xenophobia that Trump displayed throughout his election is, of course, a really big part of his appeal to white conservative evangelicals. And so those intertwined dimensions of these different forms of supremacy, and the Christian right, you know, from Reagan to the present day, has always been willing to use and support whatever leader is going to get them, you know, what they want. And Trump, even though he doesn't personally likely have any strong opposition to abortion, he was, you know, very enthusiastic from his campaign. He overstepped the Christian right narrative, which pretends that anti-abortion laws are about protecting women, and dove right into talking about that we should criminalize and imprison women for getting abortions, which is something that a lot of the Christian right groups over time had realized is not a great strategy for appealing in the mainstream. And so again, they don't disagree with what he said. They just had a different kind of strategy, which he wasn't aware of. And now we are in this current Supreme Court nomination hearing process, which, you know, indicates exactly what they assumed when they voted for him, that he would deliver the people who would, you know, target Roe v. Wade, target women's rights, reinforce the white male Christian supremacy that they were hoping for.
Thank you, Alex. That's a wonderfully comprehensive response. Tarso, Isabel, Shireen, would anyone else like to?
I'd like to riff on this a little bit. I really appreciate Alex's point that we should not get hung up on the sort of logic fallacy of seeming ideological incoherence, making for, you know, odd bedfellows or strange coalition or something like this. And a couple things to add to that, given the context of authoritarianism, and I think we are witnessing the rise of, you know, authoritarianism, American style, in the context of the US and different expressions in other places. authoritarianism is not like totalitarianism where you have amassed so much power that you can say, this is the way it is, everybody fall in line. If there's any dissent, we're done with you. Nazism, right? Fascism, classic century fascism being an expression of a variant of totalitarianism. Authoritarianism involves a level of consolidation of power that's not absolute in the need to incorporate and to kind of juggle and balance competing power block interests. And so some of what is gets attributed to some stylistic incoherence, and there is stylistic incoherence, is also just about saying the things that different parts of his base want to hear and not worrying about whether they're reconcilable in a logical way, because that's part of the style of authoritarian leadership. You're speaking to these different interest blocks and bringing them along. I guess two more things about that. One is that, part of what's happened is that, implicitly a more theocratic, right, whether it's in the US context, say the evangelical and Catholic right, for instance, or the Hindu right in India and other places, implicitly need more authoritarian relations in order to impose the order that they want. They require a very strong militarized state. And that's also the case, right, inherently with racial ethnic nationalism. I mean, the United States is born out of a slave society that understands and has incubated and developed many of the technologies of authoritarianism, just not applied to the whole population, right? Applied to internally or externally colonized populations. And so that's part of the building blocks that authoritarianism has in its toolkit. And then we have this more libertarian or free market capitalist, wing, which is not necessarily that interested, all of it, in more authoritarian relations. On the other hand, some of it is, and it's built a level of economic inequality into their model that requires more authoritarian policing relationships in order to sustain. So even if it's not ideologically what they're all interested in, functionally they require it at this point. So there is a kind of convergence of a modality of the exercise of power that transcends ideology. And we see this on a global level where, you can be the prime minister of Israel and an anti-Semite leading, the nation of Hungary and want to sit at the same authoritarian club table because there's a new axis, right, that's less defined by this notion of, who's democratic and, the free world versus, right, the socialist, the communist world in those fictions that we had in the 20th century. And there's a different organization of power that's less interested in those ideological, I think, distinctions. And then the last thing is that given the influence of racial nationalism in the US at this point, there are particular ways in which I think the modality of controlling women's bodies and why and to what ends are also shifting. They're, to Alex's point, I think, aligned enough, but not without tensions and contradictions with, say, what the evangelical right and so forth would want. But when your goal becomes to ensure the permanent and perpetual, right, supermajority of white people in a territory, ideally is the ethno-state, but flexible about how else we might organize that, then you really have to have racialized control of immigration, of carceral policy, of reproduction. And so when we see incidents like, mass sterilizations of, women in a Georgia detention center, we should be asking ourselves, how systemic is that in a moment where that's a priority for an agenda that this administration has endorsed in terms of who's this country for, who are the real people of this country and so forth. And then of course, expulsion and elimination by other means than expulsion is part of that. And so all of these shift the dynamics and the priorities of why and how women's bodies and which women's bodies are regulated in which ways. And those things change over time, even if the regulation part doesn't. Why and to whose end and in service of what agenda. And that's being negotiated somewhat differently, I think, both in the US and in a variety of places around the world.
Thank you, Tarso. Isabel, Shireen, would either of you like to respond before I move to the next question?
Yeah, I want to put a different spin on it. And so thanks, Alex and Tasso, for sort of shining a light on how this is playing out within the US context. And Tasso, through your last comment, an invitation to kind of open up in terms of the bigger, right, global picture. And I think it's really important in this moment to say that, you know, while the chickens are coming home to roost, let me just put it that way, right? And by that I mean, you know, there are many regions and countries in the world, as we all know, who have lived with, who've had their lives shaped by a set of inequalities, including, right, the footprint of the meaning of that consolidation of power in the interests of countries in the North, right? And it's really interesting for me in this moment, positioned as I am as somebody from Southern Africa, to see what is happening in the US and to see it as part of an almost a looping back in some way, because I think that we've seen the historical theft of resources, you know, economic restructuring through structural adjustment programs, and the gutting of countries as a result of, you know, extractivism or the interests of power. And I think that is clear for all of us to see globally over decades. But in this moment, you know, whether you are, and by this moment, I mean this moment of the pandemic exposing in a more dramatic way the inequities that we're living with, whether you're on the left or the right or the center, you know, you are seeing manipulated responses to lockdown, you know, to the pandemic through lockdowns and curfews, and how it is that governments are dealing with the situation as a way of further consolidating power, right? And a level of authoritarianism through repression and violence. And I think for countries in the global North, these realities may have become even more stark in the last number of years, particularly with the political mobilization and rise of, you know, the right of religious fundamentalism, of militias, including their ascent to power, right? So we knew that these forms existed, but we are now seeing people in, right, governments at the seats, you know, at the decision-making table. And I think with that, we are also seeing around the world collusions between elites, right? In the interests of particular kinds of agendas. So on the African continent, whether this is sold under the guise of preventing terrorism or dealing with migration or ensuring that you have safer borders so that you don't have people migrating from the African continent into Europe, it's all part of the same thing, right? And how it is that, you know, language is also sustaining government arrangements that benefit power and not the majority of people and their agency and voice.
Thank you, Shireen, for the broader analysis, you know, and bringing us to a global perspective, something PRA doesn't get to do all the time. I think this is a really wonderful conversation to be able to explore these ideas outside of our borders. You also mentioned sort of some of the mechanisms occurring in the pandemic lockdowns globally, and I want to move us to that next, this question of the disproportionate negative impact on women over men. In the US, my stats are from the US, but I think we can talk about this globally as well. In September alone in the US, 865,000 women over the age of 20 dropped out of the US workforce right around when school came back into session, more than 4 times the number of men in the same age group. And in a different vein, as documented by the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, President Trump's unwillingness to wear a mask and acknowledge the severity of COVID-19, especially after having contracted it, is a continuation of his performative masculinity that has appealed so strongly to his political base. What lessons have we learned from these very unique sociopolitical and economic conditions about the impermanence of women's advancement? And what has the global pandemic reinforced in our understanding of misogyny? I want to open this question to our panel.
Yeah, I'd love to answer this one. It's a great one. I mean, just to pick up on the Trump, the description about this kind of toxic masculinity, I mean, I think it's been a really fascinating example. It's a very clear sort of crystallization of this strongman politics that is so integral for him and for others like Duterte in the Philippines or Modi or Bolsonaro in Brazil. But this kind of toxic masculinity, but also you know, the very kind of ableist narrative that's tied in there, right? So he's too manly to wear a mask. He's you know, too strong to be taken down by a virus, and it's kind of this very heady mix of kind of this idea that disability or illness is somehow weakness as well, right? And it's very tied into the free market fundamentalism of it all as well. So, you know, this idea that there couldn't possibly be a collective response where we're looking out for each other. It has to be about, you know, individual strength or individual solutions, you know, this kind of idea that the weak can kind of perish for the sake of the economy. And I thought it was really interesting, the whole pushing of the anti-malarial drugs as well, with him and Bolsonaro. And at first I was like, I don't think I get this. And then talking with the colleague, we were saying, well, it's this idea that if there is a solution, the solution has to be individualized, right? It couldn't be a public health response where you look after, you know, everybody that needs access to healthcare. That the solution is like it has to be a drug you take, and probably one that you pay for. So I thought the whole thing was fascinating. And about the kind of first piece you mentioned, I mean, I definitely echo what Shireen was saying. Like, this is not, I wouldn't frame it so much as like an advancement being interrupted as a kind of rupture where we're seeing it all, you know, shed light on all these inequalities were kind of already there. And about the dropping out of the workplace, it's you know, very much linked to unequal care burdens. That's always been the case. Women have always had to take up the slack, but it's just kind of come out in different ways, and we're seeing it more perhaps. But I really think you know, it's really important to listen to the demands of feminist movements right now. AWOOD was part of a campaign with a number of other feminists calling for a feminist bailout, kind of responding to the fact that there's been such a push from corporations to be bailed out with public funds, and that actually we need to bail out the people, and that we kind of not accepting a return to business as normal or business as usual. You know, if that was the normal, we don't want to go back to that normal, right?
Thank you, Isabel. Would anybody, Shireen?
Yeah, I mean, I think just building on what Isabel has said, I mean, we know this, right? And certainly at Jazz, you know, 15, 16 plus years of supporting women's organizing has told us that actually women and gender non-conforming people who are, for want of a better word, on the margins in terms of who is written into the logic of who constitutes the nation, right? Or the citizen in the nation, have been the people who have been at the forefront of actually sustaining themselves and finding sustainable solutions, right? And I think that's what we see in this moment. In the first 4 months of the pandemic, you know, the work that we as Jazz did in relation to a mobilization fund that supports communities, you know, in crisis, to both meet basic needs as well as strengthen their organizing, showed us that women were the majority of the people who were thinking about where do we get the food, how do we stay safe, how do we ensure that we are safe from violence, etc., etc. And in doing that, we're building and strengthening the community ties to ensure safety, as well as to come up with innovative ways of how we now do this, because the state has sold us out, essentially. And I think that's part of the point. So this is like a big statement and we can debate it. But I think a patriarchal capitalist state, as we see, only has its own interests at heart. If it is going to benefit them to put in place the policies or the mechanisms in support of women's rights, then that will happen. But as we see in many countries around the world, that can also very easily be abrogated, right? Depending on the interests of the state. And so in that kind of a model, of course, women are going to be hardest hit. Of course, women are going to be the most vulnerable. Of course, you're going to have levels of precariousness that start stacking up because the imaginary of the system does not write in that group of people in a way that counts. So you are always on the terrain of vulnerability and violence.
Thank you, Shireen. Would anybody like to pick up on Shireen's big statement? Before we move on to talking about, the movements, the feminist movements that we, turn to for answers, for strategy, and for wisdom, I want us to finish with a conversation on sort of manifestations of public violence. This last week, several men were arrested for plotting to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's been a frequent target of vitriol directed at politicians who prioritize long-term health outcomes over short-term economic interest during the pandemic and resulting lockdowns. Similarly, as I've mentioned, there's a consistent theme in US politics that has heightened over the past 4 years of female political leaders across the political spectrum facing gendered, sexualizing, and objectifying criticisms and attacks from their political opponents and violent misogynist threats from far-right groups. In a slightly different vein, in February of this year, the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism published a piece on male supremacist terrorism as a rising threat just months before two separate violent incel attacks in the US and Canada. Alex, I want to turn to you to ask how the vitriol leveled at women in positions of power relate to these instances of public violence, and can you tell us a little about the incel community and their implications for future violence?
Sure, that's a nice big topic. One of the things that I discuss in that piece about male supremacist violence and terrorism is the importance of being aware of the threat posed by multiple types of male supremacist movements and ideologies. And so misogynist incel communities, which are communities that now the most prominent of them are specifically men only, that are feel that it is an injustice that they do not have sexual access to women's bodies. And as part of that framing of male sexual entitlement and injustice, that has been parlayed into a justification for acts of violence and mass violence, and acts that I think can be considered terrorist attacks that are meant to strike fear into the hearts of women for not being sexually available to men at will. And misogynist incel ideology has gained significant attention since two prominent attacks in 2018 that have brought new awareness to this movement that hadn't been there, even though there had been prior attacks in 2014 and 2015. And the continued threat and increasing threat posed by misogynist incels and the encouragement and cover that they get from support for misogyny in society and culture and media is definitely a significant concern. But a problem that we have seen is that the focus on incels in some ways comes at the expense of a focus on misogyny and male supremacy more broadly. And media have been quick to call male perpetrators of violence incels because there was misogyny or sexual entitlement in their writings or rhetoric, but they weren't actually connected specifically to this community or that ideology. And so branding them incels becomes this way to talk about something that, you know, is at the same time as is a sort of broad problem with the alt-right, seen as like, this is a term that is sort of trendy to talk about. It's something that is simultaneously kind of humorous. It's hard sometimes to discuss misogynist incel ideology and really emphasize that this is, you know, a movement ideology around injustice, because people just want to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction of dismissing, like, oh, like this is, you know, ludicrous. They're like sense of entitlement, you know, they're, you know, just, you know, men who probably live in their parents' basements. And so being able to focus on, look, this is one expression of male supremacist ideology that is relevant. There was an attack earlier this year that targeted a female Latina federal judge that ended up shooting her husband and her son, who opened the door of their home. And the perpetrator was a longtime men's rights lawyer who had recently become more involved with MGTOW, men going their own way communities, which is essentially a male separatist community that takes anti-feminist conspiracism to such a height that really deeply believes in, you know, feminists using false accusations of sexual violence and harassment as a means of control of men, that they argue for disassociating from women altogether. And that community, you know, is one that shows similar kinds of disturbing radical rhetoric that we would be concerned about, not only in a community like misogynist incels, but the conspiracism and the separatism that we see in MGTOWs is particularly similar to white separatist movements, and tends to remind me of the Turner Diaries and some of their kind of imaginaries of, you know, their state, which we know are things that have motivated violence in the past. And so, and then we also have, you know, within male supremacism, if we think back to 2016 and the Southern Poverty Law Center's tracking of hate crimes, as they designate them, and hate speech following the 2016 election, and this disproportionate, you know, gender-based violence is often not counted as a hate crime because it is so ubiquitous and interpersonal, and is not usually seen as a hate crime, even though it is disproportionately, you know, cisgendered men against women, either cis or trans. But because of the rhetoric of Trump himself, people were harassing women using the specific language that Trump had used and referencing Trump. And so there was a much clearer line from that ideology, which I think is something that hasn't been discussed as much in recent years. And so there are all of these different forms of male supremacism and violence as a culture, you know, as a culture of toxic masculinity, and male supremacism is an intrinsic part of male dominance. It's an intrinsic part of police violence. It's an intrinsic part of militia violence, that these are interrelated kinds of issues. And so to, you know, return back to the beginning of the question, to sum up with Governor Gretchen Whitmer, it's not surprising that the state in which the armed storming of the Capitol has occurred, in which this kidnapping plot occurred, in which the aggressive, violent masculinity, male dominance is, you know, at its symbolic height, was a place where not only is the governor a woman, but she also, you know, she gave a response to Trump's State of the Union. She is a symbol of feminism for them, and a symbolic target. And so these, you know, militia, anti-state, anti-leftist movements also intertwined with male supremacism, and the people who were involved in the kidnapping plot, at least 2 of them have been documented as amongst the armed white men who stormed the state capitol earlier this year, who were just kind of allowed to storm the state capitol with guns. And it was like, well, they're white men, and so we allow them to get away with the kind of violence that if this was, you know, a community of color participating, that we would not. And then it turns out that they are involved in this more, you know, accelerated form of, you know, plotted violent overthrow of their state government, kidnapping of female political leader, the chants of lock her up, which of course were also chants that Trump popularized around his Democratic opponent, Hillary Rodham Clinton, were used against Gretchen Whitmer. And so they've got this strain of misogyny coming through. They're obviously referencing back to things that Trump has said. And, you know, we are seeing these constant threats and warning signs that are not taken and approached seriously enough until, you know, until something happens, and often until multiple violent something happens before there's really sufficient attention to the threats that are going on.
Thank you, Alex. I think that's a wonderful way to conclude this section, you know, analysis of where we are, and turn to Shireen and Isabel for where we want to be, where we want to get to. Shireen, I'm going to start with you. JAS has a clearly defined vision for deep democracy that at its core requires the robust participation of women. Can you walk us through this vision of democracy as we turn to the second part of our conversation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Jazz has been doing some thinking over the last number of years about the meaning of, you know, a more just global feminist transition. And so linked to the point that I made earlier about women, you know, really being at the front lines of the impact of the change and the solutions, right, at a community level. You know, how we move from a more extractivist sort of economy to something that is a lot more living and interconnected is, I guess, the question. And at the heart of that is, you know, moving from domination, subordination, and violence to, you know, a model that is more about the care and belonging and respect and the cooperation, right, between parts. And I think for Jazz, you know, that really is about, to go back to your point, Tasso, you know, the meaning of deep democracy, and how it is that, you know, commons and community ownership becomes part of the logics rooted actually in deep, in indigenous ways of knowing, but also, you know, how it is that we meld, right, and reweave the social fabric in a way that allows for the regeneration, that allows for ecological and social well-being. And I think for Jazz, you know, it's about the work that has to be done that moves us from this to that, or that allows us to transition, right, in that way. And I think we're seeing some of that work happening, you know. And so what does that mean? It means we've got to think about how it is that we change our models around organizing and leading, how we continue to build, you know, the collective power of movements, or build a movement of movements, right, in order to effect the change. How it is that we organize to change the rules that determine who matters and who counts, right? How it is that we organize to change the story, as in the narrative, right? And that includes how it is that we tell the history, right? And how it is that we organize to, I mean, in very simple language, to end the bad, you know, in order for something that is more vibrant, more just, more equitable, in order to be able to build the new. And I think I say that kind of floating, but it's linked to what it is that we are seeing already happening, and that has been happening, you know, in terms of organizing at community level, at national level, in a range of different ways. And I think, Tasa, you referenced you know, the movements in Syria. I mean, we've got examples in Indonesia like PKK, in Southern Africa, Malawi, the Our Bodies, Our Lives campaign, you know, in Honduras, COPIN, who are all not just shifting the agenda in terms of how it is that we are organizing and relating to each other, but are demanding that that becomes part of the modality for a better world. So I think I'll leave it there given time, Koki.
Thank you, Shireen. Isabel, I want to continue this discussion with AWID's work. AWID is a feminist movement support organization whose members, allies, and partners are resisting oppression in a wide range of political, economic, and cultural contexts. As well as your work on resisting fascisms and fundamentalisms, AWID also has an initiative working to build feminist economies. Can you tell us a little bit about how those two areas are linked?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's come out in some excellent ways already, but yeah, I think we really, when we're looking at what we're up against, we really need to see corporate power and market fundamentalism as very intrinsic parts of what's going on when we're looking at the rise of fascism and fundamentalisms or authoritarianism. I mean, for those of you that are in the US, you know, you've got this Commission on Unalienable Rights, and, you know, you see it there with the misinterpretation of freedom of religion, and alongside that, the other thing they've picked out is the right to private property. So it's like, it's very clear how those things are linked, right? And I think, Tasso, you said it at the beginning that it's the situations of inequality, the lack of rights, lack of welfare systems, social security nets that you know, where the state abandons these ideologies and movements fill in, and they present themselves as the solutions to these problems, right? Whether that's in a practical way of providing people what they need to survive whilst recruiting them, or whether that's you know, the sense of belonging as well. And in other places, you know, in Brazil, for example, the alliances between big business, agro business, military, evangelical right, that whole triad. You've got the phenomenon of the prosperity theology, prosperity gospel, which is a very individualist, neoliberal kind of framing of religion as a kind of road to individual success and fortune. And I mean, also there's so many in many places, like churches or other religious institutions, that are just, you know, they're claiming tax exemption status, and not only are they tax exempt, but they're also exempt from actually reporting on their financial flows, which is another issue. There was a piece that was talking about the tithes that came out of members of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and how that was put into an investment firm that didn't have to report on what was happening with these funds, and in 20 years it was up to like $100 billion US, which is like, it's a lot, like lots of money we're talking about in these things, right? You know, there's just a kind of collection of examples of how these trends are like so intimately linked, but and also in other spaces, like in the human rights spaces, we're seeing, you know, this coalition of more right-wing governments, and then the regressive civil society pressure groups are a threat to the international norms in those spaces, but so is the corporate capture of spaces in the UN and the influence of the corporation. So we have to look at it all as a joint problem. And I guess just echoing what Shireen said as well, like, as well as understanding how they're linked up, we need to be linked up. We need to be organizing across movements, building solidarity across reproductive justice movements, economic justice movements, climate justice movements, disability justice. You know, they're quite good at building broad churches and alliances, as we've kind of discussed. So I think we need to be better. We need to have even more cross-movement mobilization, because that's how we'll win it, I think.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Shireen. I want to conclude with one last question, looking at feminist organizing, due in part to the contestation of women's power in the home and how power is allocated in the public realm. Feminist organizing has largely occurred in generational shifts, with each successive generation of women building on the work of past feminist movements to wrestle more power and voice. Nearly half of AWID's movement members are under the age of 30. JAS leadership is structured as an intergenerational body. Shireen, can you talk to the role that generational knowledge and intergenerationality play in feminist organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to tell a story. Given that this year is the year that we are commemorating, holding the meaning of the Beijing Platform for Action, right? Which was, 1995, big UN World Conference on Women on the back of 2 other world conferences. Last year, I had the opportunity to come into conversation with an intergenerational set of feminists who were thinking about the meaning of Beijing Plus 25. And some of the people who were in the room were women who started organizing in the 1970s, right, for Nairobi and for Mexico, and then for Beijing. And also in the room were, a set of activists who are, chronologically younger, but equally as wise, who are thinking deeply, in Mesoamerica about the meaning of femicide and the use of technology and direct action as a way of protest. And there was a really interesting conversation that was set up. And I think the point that I want to make and that I want to leave as a short form of answering the question is this: when the women and who were involved historically in the organizing started reflecting about the meaning of Beijing, it wasn't so much about the moment of the platform for action being ratified and adopted by the UN. It was about the organizing that accrued in the lead up to this thing that we call Beijing, right? That was where the investment and the energy and the transnational solidarity lay that made us stronger. And so I loop back then to answer your question, Koki, that, I think sometimes we get squeezed into a modality that makes young an issue, right? And I think we've got to be careful about that, because any one issue sits and lands in a range of different ways depending on the body, right, that it lands on. And I think how it is that you are able to hold, hear, and see, and that requires work, right? The meaning of intergenerational and the power of intergenerational organizing as linked to history as well as futures, I think is absolutely critical in this moment.
Thank you, Shireen. Isabel, do you want to talk a little bit about AWID's generational perspective?
Oh yeah, a little bit. Well, I mean, yeah, I agree. We shouldn't, I think this is maybe slightly what Shireen is saying, we shouldn't put kind of false boxes around age and generation and not create a false division, because I mean, we have feminists of all ages that are pushing for structural change, and we also have anti-rights authoritarian actors of all ages. There's a lot of young women in Europe that with a similar age as me who are also on the other side, right? But I do think, having said that, there has been an importance within feminist movements to kind of question all sorts of privileges, right? And one of those is age, and that has involved bringing to the fore and giving more space to young feminist activists. We did have a young feminist activism program at AWID, which we no longer have it, but that was because the perception was that the young feminist movement was so strong that it was no longer needed. So yeah, I think that's a reflection on how well young feminists are responding to these issues despite a lack of resources a lot of time, and sometimes without a lot of space to be heard. But I think they're often on the front lines of resisting fascisms, especially working in radical ways across movements, and kind of as things have changed since the Beijing moment, maybe making less demands that are of the state and making demands that are of are different, targeting in different ways, doing direct action, as Shireen said. So yeah.
Thank you. Alex, Tarso, would either of you like to chime in on the movement space?
I'll just say briefly that one of our priorities at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism is believing that it's really important to connect research to action, and that is a core value of what we do, and what a core value of what PRA does as well. And so I think that, it is the nature of the work we do in engaged scholarship that we really value partnering with organizers. We are working on a summer school for organizers on contesting supremacist movements for next year. That was inspired by a training that I gave that included one of PRA's researchers, Chloe Cooper, last year at Western State Center's Activist Mobilizing for Power conference, where one day just wasn't enough to talk about all of the elements of supremacist movements. And so we're building on, what we can do in those respects. My research looks at, beyond what I do on contemporary male supremacist movements, looks at the past half century of right-wing organizing in the United States and how they are successful and how to contest them. And I think that being able to bring in, in dealing with issues like authoritarianism and other aspects of right-wing and far-right organizing, lessons from feminist and reproductive justice movements and the kind of issues that they focus on are really important. I think that comprehensive sexuality education is a really potentially strong and useful space for contesting male supremacy and misogyny, as well as anti-LGBT ideologies and the other cultures that go along with the way that absence-only programs tend to teach elements of women's subservience and male dominance and excuses for men and things like that. And this is something that, coming from a reproductive justice space, discussions of sex education and absence-only education are really significant, but not so much in looking at a far-right space kind of more broadly. And the focus on education, reaching younger people, and those kinds of movements, I think, is a particularly kind of strong concern. And so I think it's really inspiring, a lot of the work that feminist and anti-fascist and other activist groups on the ground have been doing in attempting to contest supremacist organizing in their backyards, and also the kind of mobilizations that go on through online organizing and the joint between those things, and that we really hope to be able to continue with that work and to have the kind of intersectional approaches that are needed to confronting supremacist, authoritarian, etc. kind of threats as a whole, and to be able to really get at the root problems and challenge both, the problems that we are facing today, and also plan for the long term, because where we are today was decades in the making, and it's going to be a long-term agenda to bring us to the kind of anti-racist, feminist society that we would really ideally like to have.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to conclude us with one audience Q&A, one audience question from Adnan. How do you understand the growth of more recent conspiracy movements that seem to be predicated on anti-establishment views, consistent with traditional populist ideologies and general conspiracy sentiments, with that of far-right and secular ideological, misogynist, white male supremacist movements? With the rise and increasing significance of conspiracy movements like QAnon, we've seen what we like to call conspiracy collapse, housing many beliefs and incorporating movements on the far end of both the right and the left of the political spectrum. We see the role women play in this movement as well, but we also see this through the lens of misogyny being foundational, the perpetuation of traditional heterosexual patriarchal gender roles, the targeting of women who speak out against them. Is this movement really different from what we've seen in the past? Big question, lots of interesting lots of interesting components. Would anyone like to take the first shot at it?
Yeah, so I mean, the male supremacist movements that we look at, the rise in anti-feminist conspiracy theories is a really key element that has distinguished these movements. Multiple fellows of ours have written about QAnon in the past month. Annie Kelly's work, Julia DeCook's really looks extensively at conspiracy theories. Conspiratorial thinking has always been something that is open to bringing together a lot of different ideologies, because the framework of conspiracy thinking can, easily pull in other elements. And so it's not really particularly different in that sense. What is different is just what the focus of the conspiratorial thinking is at a given time. Another PRA's researchers, Ben Lorber and I, have had some really good conversations about how anti-feminist conspiracism as a form of anti-establishment and anti-elite conspiracy theories looks a lot like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we've been familiar with for a longer period of time, as feminists have, gained some actual power and advances for women over the past few decades that is parlayed into this conspiratorial belief that they have substantially more power than they actually have. And then I guess the second element of what is maybe different today is, of course, just the element to which conspiratorial thinking is coming from a prominent position in our government, and support for that is particularly dangerous and somewhat unusual. And I think the pandemic itself as a crisis, that crises are rife for conspiratorial thinking, that they can build on the conspiracy theories of past years. And it's a space that can bring together various kind of forms of conspiratorial thinking, including ones that are often more characterized by liberal thought. The anti-vaccine movement, anti-vaxxers, tends to be a movement that is on the left, but in anticipation of there being a vaccine for COVID-19 and protesting that, they had joined in with right-wing anti-lockdown protesters and the white supremacists and male supremacists who were a part of those movements and organizing as well. And so, consistent with the past, conspiracy theories are always something to be concerned about. And then also particular strains based on the crisis that we are facing and the support coming from government that brings some kind of extra weight to these conspiracy theories, and the powers of the internet and social media, and helping with the dissemination of misinformation as a communications method.
Thank you, Alex. Tarso, did you want to chime in?
I would only add two little things to that. One is I do think that the rate of transmission that's possible now, given just the technologies available, mean that the level of kind of metastasizing the spread and adaptation and change, the deployment, for instance, of QAnon in a very blood libel kind of anti-Semitic way in Germany, as we're seeing happening very recently in different expressions in other places, and the rate of that transmission is perhaps a little different than what we've seen in the past, even with conspiracy theories that have gone global and remained held up to that kind of durability over time. I guess the other thing, I do think that it's worth asking the question about how conspiracy theories in this moment relate to the crisis of legitimacy of the state. And that's not always because it's a weak state. In some cases, it's a weak state. In some cases, it's a state that's relying on a politic and a technique of power and disinformation in order to foster a level of cynicism and a level of decentralization of other authority bases, including scientific and other authority bases, that makes it easier for authoritarian power to exercise itself. So there have been always been conspiracy theories, but the context in which they're operating and how they give service, right, to concentration of power can shift over time. I do worry that in this moment, these particularly overlap with the utility in sowing a kind of cynicism about information, a kind of flexibility in terms of what is truth, endlessly contestable, right? Notions of what's true, or the basis of coming to conclusions about fundamental questions of just perception of reality. So that is worrisome, I think, in this moment.
Thank you, Tarso. Last thoughts before we conclude. All right, thank you all for joining us today. This was a really fabulous conversation. Thank you, Isabel, Shireen, Alex, and Tarso for joining us. It's, wonderful to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of misogyny and how it manifests in really interesting ways in the US and abroad. And I think the global perspective was a really nice component of this conversation, especially as part of this webinar series leading us up to the US 2020 election. On that note, for everyone watching, tune in next week. We have Peter Beinart and Linda Sarsour joining us for a conversation on Christian Zionism. And in the meantime, I just want to say thank you again all for joining.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Koki, for keeping us on track.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Koki.